JD Vance adjusted his navy blue suit jacket as he took his seat at the defendant's table. He wasn't nervous. He had faced challenges far greater than this in his life. But there was an undeniable weight in the air. He could feel the tension crackling around the courtroom, especially from the bench where Judge Rebecca Calloway sat, her sharp gaze locked onto him. Judge Calloway was known for her strict interpretations of legal precedents, and she had no patience for anything she deemed unprofessional or inappropriate in her courtroom. She was in her mid-50s, with perfectly styled silver hair and an expression that rarely wavered from one of stern disapproval. She glanced down at the file before her, then back up at JD Vance, her lips pressing into a thin line. Before the trial could even begin, she leaned forward slightly and cleared her throat. "Mr. Vance, before we proceed, I need to address something," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The accessory on your suit lapel. It violates the neutrality standards of this courtroom." JD instinctively glanced down at the small gold crosspin fastened to his jacket. It was nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious, just a simple symbol of his faith, something he had worn countless times without issue. He looked back at the judge, his brow furrowing. "Your Honor, with all due respect, it's just a pin," he said evenly. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Regardless, it is a religious symbol, and in this courtroom, we do not allow personal displays of faith that could imply bias. I am issuing a fine of $500 for non-compliance with court decorum." A hushed murmur swept through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, a staunch opponent of JD Vance, looked momentarily surprised by the decision. JD remained composed, though a flicker of something, amusement, maybe disbelief, crossed his features. He could argue this, he knew he could, but he also knew better than to react emotionally in a courtroom setting. Instead, he calmly unfastened the pin, placed it on the table in front of him, and folded his hands together. "If this is the battle you want to fight, Your Honor, I respect your ruling, but I do hope we can apply the law with the same precision to all matters at hand today," JD said, his voice steady. Judge Calloway pursed her lips, but said nothing further on the matter. She simply gave a curt nod and turned her attention to the legal proceedings. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. JD Vance was about to make a legal argument so compelling, so airtight, that by the end of the hearing, the judge herself would have no choice but to acknowledge what she had overlooked. And the entire courtroom would witness a moment that no one would forget. The trial proceeded as planned, with both sides presenting their arguments. JD Vance, known for his sharp legal mind and ability to cut straight to the heart of an issue, listened intently as the opposing attorney laid out their case. His expression was calm, measured, but anyone who knew him well could tell he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Judge Rebecca Calloway maintained her firm posture on the bench, occasionally glancing down at her notes, but there was an undeniable tension between her and JD. The fine she had imposed for his crosspin still hung in the air, an unspoken challenge neither had forgotten. Then it happened. JD stood from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the center of the courtroom. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of confidence behind his words. "Your Honor, before I continue my argument, I'd like to clarify something regarding your ruling earlier," JD began, turning slightly toward Judge Calloway. "You fined me $500 for wearing a religious symbol, correct?" The judge narrowed her eyes. "Correct. The courtroom must remain neutral, Mr. Vance." JD nodded. "Understood. So let's talk about neutrality." He gestured toward the prosecution table. "I couldn't help but notice that the lead prosecutor is wearing a lapel pin as well, a rainbow flag. Does that not also represent a set of beliefs?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Judge Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line, but JD wasn't done. "And on the wall behind you, Your Honor, there's a framed quote about justice from a Supreme Court ruling. A ruling that, I might add, is highly political in nature. Does that not also represent a perspective? A stance? Silence. JD took another step forward, his eyes locked on the judge. Neutrality isn't about silencing faith, it's about ensuring fairness. And fairness doesn't mean picking and choosing which symbols are acceptable based on personal preference. The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Calloway's gaze remained locked on JD, her fingers lightly gripping the gavel in front of her. JD exhaled slowly, letting his words settle before delivering his final point. If we're truly committed to impartiality, then we must be consistent. Either we allow all symbols, or we allow none, but selectively punishing one expression of belief while allowing others. He shook his head slightly. That's not neutrality. That's discrimination. For the first time that day, Judge Calloway seemed uncertain. She glanced at the court reporter, then at the prosecutor, then back at JD. The weight of his words had landed, and there was no easy way to dismiss them. The gallery, lawyers, clerks, spectators, sat in stunned silence. Some exchanged glances, others scribbled notes. Even those who disagreed with JD politically couldn't deny that he had made an airtight legal argument. JD returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. He had planted the seed. Now it was up to Judge Calloway to decide what she would do next. And everyone in that courtroom knew, whatever her decision, it would be remembered. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. JD Vance leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded on the table in front of him, waiting. He knew he had put Judge Rebecca Calloway in an impossible position, one where she would either have to admit her inconsistency or double down on a ruling that now seemed legally unsound. Judge Calloway shifted in her seat, adjusting her robe as she glanced down at her notes. Her face remained composed, but the tension in her posture was obvious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice measured, "I must admit, your argument presents a compelling challenge to the principles we uphold in this courtroom." JD remained silent, watching her carefully. The judge tapped her gavel lightly against the bench. "The fine I imposed earlier was based on the belief that religious symbols have no place in a neutral legal setting. However, upon reflection, I see that the standard I applied was not equally enforced." Gasps echoed through the room. The prosecutor stiffened in his seat, and several spectators leaned forward, eyes wide. This was not the response they had expected. Judge Calloway took a deep breath. "If I am to remain consistent, then I must either revoke the fine against Mr. Vance or begin imposing similar restrictions on all ideological symbols present in this courtroom." She glanced toward the prosecutor's table, where the rainbow flag lapel pin remained in full view. For the first time since the trial began, JD saw something shift in the judge's demeanor. She wasn't just considering the immediate consequences. She was reckoning with a much larger issue. "Mr. Vance," she continued, her voice steady, "I am officially rescinding the fine imposed against you. The court recognizes that fairness must be upheld without bias, and any ruling that contradicts that principle must be corrected." The room exploded into murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered heatedly to one another. The courtroom clerk stole a glance at JD, while the bailiff, who had remained stone-faced the entire trial, let out a quiet exhale, almost as if he'd been holding his breath. But Judge Calloway wasn't done. She turned to the prosecution. "From this point forward, I will be reviewing our courtroom decorum policies to ensure all individuals are treated with equal respect, regardless of their personal beliefs." The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but no words came. He knew there was no way to argue without making it painfully obvious that the previous ruling had been unfair. JD nodded slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting in the faintest hint of satisfaction. He hadn't just won his case, he had set a precedent. As the judge wrapped up the session and dismissed the court, JD stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. Some people applauded quietly, while others looked visibly upset, but that didn't matter, because today, something more important had happened. Truth had won, and JD knew that no matter what came next, this moment would not be forgotten. JD Vance stood his ground, and in the end, fairness and truth prevailed. This story is a reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but when you do, it can create real change. What do you think about the judge's final decision? Should religious and ideological symbols be treated equally in courtrooms? Let's talk about it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible story like this. Your support helps us continue sharing these inspiring moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.